Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Welcome to our ritual night talk for April 29th. So, I'm getting a little better. Last week it was Saturday, this week it's Friday. I am definitely going to try and get back to putting together the Elixir Rite, which is going to be on Tuesday. I'm going to try and get that to post at the right time so it actually will go up at 8 o'clock when we're starting the ritual. So, that's my goal for this weekend. But tonight, we're going to be talking about Planetary Magic. And I have included a link to a post I put together on Planetary Magic. Also have included a link to an article on the greater ritual of the hexagram, which is what you use to work with planets in the thelemic system. And finally, the donation link. All donations go to support Leaping Laughter OTO in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And, getting a little ahead of myself, I am Scott Stenwick, your host for these Ritual Night events, presented under the auspices of Leaping Laughter OTO in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So, Planetary Magic is the thing that lots of people want to work with, right? You come into magic and you start learning elements and stuff like that, and they're like, oh, but the planets have all these cool powers. And, I mean, this is also true when you look at grimoires from the Renaissance, and a little before that, you have a lot of planetary magic in there. You have a lot of stuff that's associated with, this kind of sevenfold structure. It's the 7 days of the week. You have, 7 angels, 7 spirits. Even in the Heptarchia Mystica, which is John Dee's planetary grimoire, you have the king and the prince for the day of the week, and they're attributed to the planets and so forth. And so this is a really common schema for use in magic. And there are a couple of reasons for it. So first of all, like I mentioned last week with the talk on elemental magic. So elemental magic can work faster, but it's not as powerful as planetary magic. Planetary magic, you can usually get a bigger effect than you can from elemental magic, but often it takes a little bit longer. Like with a planet, element, you might be able to get something, in a few days. Planets, it's more common. You see a week or two or something like that for results. Then zodiac operations, which I will be getting to after the elixir this Tuesday, are going to be more powerful, but they tend to take longer. A lot of astrological stuff can take more like months as opposed to weeks, but they could do really powerful things. So that's kind of the trade-off. I mean, it's almost like using a gear shifter. It's like depending on what lever you're using, the amount of force versus the amount of result can vary. And so planets are kind of in the middle. They're sort of, I could do an operation that could take like a couple of weeks. I don't necessarily need something in the next 3 or 4 days. And I'd rather get something better, a week or two down the line. And so I think that that's one of the reasons that people move on to planets. The other reason, again, like I mentioned last week, is people don't completely understand that the elements, then the planets, then the zodiac, they all represent complete systems. So in terms of, you could do pretty much any kind of thing with a planet that you could do with an element or that you could do with a sign. It's just structured a little bit differently. And so what you wind up with is, the basic stuff that people do magic for. Like I said last week, it's all represented under the elements. It is also represented a little more straightforwardly under the planets. And so what you have is you have Saturn. The path of Saturn rules works of wrath and judgment. Works of malediction and death. Mars uses works of wrath and vengeance. Jupiter is political and other ascendancy. Sun is the power of acquiring wealth. Venus is love filters, love spells in general. Mercury is gift of tongues, knowledge of sciences, and miracles of healing. And the moon is clairvoyance, clairaudience, and divination by dreams in Libra 777. Those are the paths for the planets on the Tree of Life. That's how we represent it in the Naples arrangement, which is Crowley's version of the Tree of Life, which is pretty similar to the Golden Dawn version, but not identical with it. So, in addition to the practical planetary powers, the planets are often also attributed to mystical powers, and those mystical powers are mapped to the Sephiroth above Malkut. So you have Yesod is the vision of the machinery of the universe. Hod is the vision of splendor. And Netzach is the vision of beauty triumphant. And okay, so Yesod is moon, Hod is Mercury. Netzach is Venus, attributed to the vision of beauty triumphant. Tifereth is the sun, attributed to the beatific vision. Also, things like knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. Mars is the vision of power, which is Gebirah. Chesed, Jupiter, is the vision of love. And finally, Saturn, Bina, is the vision of sorrow and the vision of wonder, which paradoxically are the same thing. In the context of a master of the temple who has crossed the abyss and is and attains that level of mastery, that is stabilization of consciousness in Bina, according to our system. So there's that duality with the planets. So you have both a magical application of the planet and you have a mystical application of the planet. And some of these are different, okay? So you have an angel that does all these different things. But one of the examples is that in the Sephirothic system, the angel Michael is attributed to Hod, which is Mercury. And Raphael is attributed to Tifereth, which is the sun. However, when working with the paths, these flip. So Raphael rules the path of Mercury, and Michael rules the path of the sun. And this comes up so often on magical groups that I wanted to specifically address it here. It is not the case that, well, which one is it? Okay, well, in different contexts, they can be different. You know, Michael is also the angel of fire. Raphael is also the angel of air. And so angels aren't stuck with necessarily just like one-to-one powers, okay? Angels that are attributed to different places can have multiple powers. And then some of them line up and some of them don't. So Gabriel is the moon. Gabriel is also water. Gabriel is also Yesod, for example. So Sephira of the moon, path of the moon, and then the element of water. Gabriel rules all three of those. But with Michael and Raphael, they get flipped. And newbies are always getting confused about asking, well, which way is it, sun or Mercury? Well, they don't necessarily map one-to-one. And so that's one of the things that you need to understand about this. They have both magical and mystical aspects, and depending on which aspect you're working with, the result can be, well, it winds up mapping back to a different power or quality. And so that's important to understand. The next thing that's important to understand is that planets work by sphere of influence. Actually, all magical qualities do. But a lot of people miss this one when they're starting out. So Saturn rules works of malediction and death, right? You know, you curse with Saturn, okay? But Saturn rules works of malediction and death. So not only a curse that you would send at somebody, but Saturn can protect you from a curse. So you could conjure up the angel of Saturn and you could say, protect me from all works of malediction and death directed at me. And that would be something that Cassiel, angel of Saturn, would be totally able to do. Use a practical power for that because it's a practical effect. And so that's why you're calling on Cassiel and not Zafkiel, who is the angel of Bina. So the thing is that when you're looking at this, it's important to understand that, you know, some people will do things like, I've seen this where, and I actually did this for years. Oh, I have limitations that I want to deal with, so I'll banish Saturn to get rid of limitations. Okay? Sounds logical, right? Except the better way to do it, that you figure out when you've done magic longer, is actually you invoke Saturn, you call up Cassiel, and you call on Cassiel to remove this limitation, or maybe even empower a talisman to, remove this limitation. And the talisman can be drawn in colors corresponding to the planet. It can include, it can be made of material specific to the planet, so like a metal or a stone. Like a Jupiter talisman could be tin, which is a little hard to find, or amethyst, which is fairly easy to find. I usually use amethyst for my Jupiter talismans. And so, at any rate, what's going on there is that you are calling on Saturn, who rules over a particular area. Mars can be thought of as the same way, works of wrath and vengeance. Okay? Well, Mars rules works of wrath and vengeance. So you can invoke Mars, path form, to protect yourself from works of wrath and vengeance directed at you. You don't have to just call on these planets when you want to like do something nasty to somebody. They have a strong protective function because they can control these kinds of operations and dispel them or send them away if necessary. Likewise, a planet like Jupiter. Jupiter is political and other ascendancy is what the path rules, okay? And so Jupiter can be used for jobs, finances, or literally in politics, okay? But remember that Jupiter rules political and other ascendancy. So it is not necessarily the case that you invoke Jupiter if you want. Jupiter is political and other ascendancy, so I just invoke Jupiter if I want that. Well, you do, but bear in mind that you can also curse with Jupiter. You can use Jupiter to remove someone's political ascendancy, for example. So like let's say you're looking at an election, okay? And there's two things that you could do. If it's an election between two candidates, these are basically equivalent. You could either remove the political ascendancy of your of the person you don't want to win, or you can increase the political ascendancy of the person you do want to win. If you do separate operations, you can do both, and they can be synergistic. So this is an important thing to keep in mind. It's not that Jupiter is a good planet and Saturn is a bad planet. It's just that they rule over these powers. That our Saturn rules over a power that is more naturally negative, and Jupiter rules over a power that is more naturally positive. So what you're dealing with then is keeping in mind that these planets, they have these dual natures and they can flip one way or the other. Another point relative to that, if you are trying to amplify like a planetary energy in your life, remember that both the negative and positive aspects of the planets can be affected unless you use a specific charge. So one of the practices that people will sometimes do is they'll use the greater ritual of the hexagram as part of their daily practice to align themselves with the planet that corresponds to the day. So, Monday through Sunday, it's, moon through sun. And according to just the standard basic rulership. And so the deal with that is that you want to be careful, because if all you're really doing is kind of opening a window in your life to that kind of energy, and you're not giving it a charge or a shape or a direction, the energy can act on you and it can do positive or negative things within its sphere of influence. The reason that you deliver a charge when you create a talisman, which is different, by the way, than this. Okay, this is a Jupiter character and the sigil of Sachiel. Okay, and this is not a talisman. Some people get this confused, and actually I did for years too, so don't feel bad. This isn't a talisman. What you're going to do with this is like the spirit's phone number. You've got the character of Jupiter, and then you have the sigil of Sachiel, and you would do a spell like my Jupiter operation that I have on the blog. And you would take this, you put that in your containment structure, but you're not going to empower that as a talisman, because that's not a talisman. Instead, what you're going to do, go into the Jupiter box. What you're going to do is you're going to take an amethyst, or alternately, you could take a piece of tin and you could engrave the Jupiter character on it, which is that circle with the cross. And so this is actually your talisman. It sits on top of the sigil in your containment structure. And how you do this is you go ahead and you would conjure up Sachiel like you normally do. And instead of Sachiel, I charge you to do this, it is Sachiel, I charge you to empower this talisman to do the thing you want it to do. Okay? With talismans, it's less important to do things like time limits, because a talisman is a permanent or semi-permanent effect, and you can make the charge as complicated as you like. I have done talisman, if this, do this, if this, do this, this type of a thing, and almost like a little computer program for your talisman. And that's something I actually learned from studying how chaos magicians do servitors, but in fact, all those methods work perfectly fine on talismans. Just need to line up the thing. But this isn't a talisman. This is more like what I'm talking about, like the window that the spirit can act through or connect with. Okay, so you could probably carry this around on you and it might have an effect. But without a charge, it's difficult to say what that effect is going to be. It could be positive, it could be negative. You could find yourself inexplicably losing status in social circles, or suddenly not being noticed at your job. It depends on a lot of factors. Some of that has to do with the existing astrological weather, like the condition of the planet. Some of that has to do with the condition of your natal chart. It is always best to create magical effects with specific charges. You don't want to just increase this energy in your life. You want to increase the energy with a goal, with an intent, because otherwise your planet could flip and you can wind up getting something that's associated with the planet, but it's not what you want. Or it could be a reduction of something in that sphere of influence. And usually it's not necessarily the case that if you do that, what's going to happen is that, oh, you're going to like suddenly get, like a reversed effect or something like that. True reversed effects are rare, okay? That's not usually how it works. Usually if the attributions don't line up, it just doesn't work. But a talisman, there's just kind of an incoherent battery of energy associated with a quality, can feed other things in your life that are similar to that quality. So always important to do a charge, and giving a charge is an instruction. Some people all say charge in terms of putting energy into a talisman. They're two different uses of the same word. Might be nice to have better terminology, but there's many things across magic where it would be nice if the terminology were better. But, we kind of stick with what we have so people know what we're talking about. Now, when working with the planets, you want to pay attention to, first of all, things like planetary hours. I think I may have mentioned this last week that somebody who did wild magic once came, oh, I do wild magic, so I don't have to time my spells that you ceremonial magicians do. Not true. Okay, this is a thing that, you see people talking about this online. It is not true. You can do a ritual at any time. The problem is that if the astrological conditions and the timing conditions aren't as good, then what's going to happen is your ritual isn't going to work as well. And so the reason that we time rituals in the first place is to optimize them, not because they don't work at all if you don't time them. And I would argue that somebody just doing intuitive magic, well, what they're doing is going to be affected by timing as well. They're just not paying attention to it because they're just working intuitively. And so what they're going to find is they're going to find their spells are less reliable. Sometimes they'll, hit the right combination. Sometimes they won't. Whereas with ceremonial magic, you have a codified way of evaluating that. And so the planetary hours, that's one level. So planetary days are another level. And then you want to look at things like the condition of the planet. So, for example, if Jupiter is in detriment, okay, let's say it's a Gemini is detriment for Jupiter, or is one of them. And let's say that you want to do a Jupiter operation, but Jupiter is currently in detriment. Well, if you can, you might want to wait until Jupiter moves out of that sign. Now that can be annoying though, because Jupiter takes 11 years to go through the whole zodiac. So if it goes into a sign, it's usually there for a while. You can, to some degree, mediate that by looking at things like house placement. You can somewhat mediate that by calculating the chart vector. I have an article about that. I'll include the chart vector link down below too. That's a way of calculating the most powerful planet at the time you're doing your operation. So, and I am convinced that regardless of other considerations, if you've got a chart, if the chart vector is Jupiter, even if Jupiter maybe isn't in the best condition or whatnot, in terms of just by sign, you could still have a situation where Jupiter can be powerful based on all of these other factors. You do want to look at applying negative aspects, squares, oppositions to the planet you're working with. But remember with that, you're looking at electional aspects. So when the planets are moving closer to each other, okay, that is called an applying aspect. And then when the planets move past each other, okay, they're still close together, but then this is separating once they start moving apart again. And with electional astrology and with spells, you generally only need to pay attention to the applying aspects. Once the aspects start to separate, you're okay. Some astrological magicians recommend waiting a couple of degrees past culmination. Culmination is when the aspect is exact. And that's not necessarily a bad practice, and it usually doesn't take that long unless you're talking about very slow-moving planets applying to each other. And also with the applying aspect, I usually use kind of a general orb, that's how many degrees you look at, of about 5 degrees, an applying aspect that, okay, well, it's moving in this direction, but it's like 8 or 9 degrees away. Usually I'm not going to pay a lot of attention to that unless other stuff in the chart looks like it could potentially cause another problem. The other thing that you want to pay attention to is, in both the chart vector calculation and in how you're doing your operation, is the condition of the moon. So the moon is the lowest planet. It's the final dispositor of astrological energy. And so one of the things that I look at is I have a very simple electional method that is based on the moon's final aspect. You know what? I'll put that in the description too. So I've got a couple of extra links in this one. And so it's based on the moon's final aspect. And so here's how that works. So when the moon is moving through the zodiac, it makes aspects, it enters a sign, and then it makes aspects with planets as it moves through the sign. When it makes the last aspect that it's going to make in that sign, that aspect is the final aspect. After the final aspect, the moon is in a condition called void of course until it moves into the next sign. And then it starts working on the first aspect in that sign. So void of course moons usually aren't very good for practical spell casting. They can work for mystical work. It is more like a case where, it's the depositor of energy, into Malkut, which is, Asaya, which is the material world. And so trying to move things in the material world when a moon is void of course is difficult. So if you were looking at that, you might want to think, okay, well, maybe what I want to do is I want to do something like a spell to gain like the knowledge of how to fix a situation instead of like directly trying to act and fix the situation. And that would be a reasonable approach with a void moon. Information can usually flow pretty freely there, but probability influence is much more difficult, and on a void moon it doesn't work as well. The other thing to pay attention to with the final aspect is what the aspect is. So if the final aspect is a positive aspect, which is conjunction, sextile, or trine, okay, what you're going to do is, okay, that is a yes. That's a good time to do an operation. If the final aspect is an opposition or square, negative aspects, then it's not a good time to do the operation, okay? And it can make some difference which planet is making the aspect. Some discussion of this centers around, well, if it's making a conjunction or a trine with a malefic planet like Saturn or Mars, does that count? Like, well, it might or it might not, I think. I think if you're actually working with Saturn or Mars, it's fine. But they don't necessarily get along as well with the other planets. They just, as I said earlier, the powers that they rule are just naturally more negative than like the powers that the benefics, Jupiter and Venus rule. They tend to get along more with aspects to other planets and so on. In that sense, so you pay attention to those things. And bear in mind that sometimes you're just stuck. And I think this is the thing where, well, doing wild magic that I don't have to time kind of comes in. But I will point out that you can look through the system. And if you need to do it on a particular day, there are things that you can do in terms of looking at, what rising sign is showing up. And you can look at what house the planet is in, and some other factors like on the chart vector calculation to try and get the planet you're working with in the best condition possible under the circumstances that you have to work with it. And, magic is sometimes making do. And I have done those rituals and I have gotten results. The best results you get is when everything is timed right. But you can still get good results with the planet, especially if you've been working with the spirit for a long time. And you have a relationship with that spirit. They're going to be a little more amenable to helping you out and stuff like that, regardless of their condition. So one of the most popular systems of planetary magic that's around is from Agrippa, and that's where like this character of Jupiter. That's from Agrippa, and Sachiel is the angel of Jupiter, according to Agrippa. And So this would be a path operation that this would be used for. If you see one of these and it's blue, it's a Sephirothic operation. So this purple, actually violet, is the color of the path of Jupiter, whereas blue is the color of Hesed, which is the Sephira of Jupiter, for the vision of love, as opposed to the path being the path being political and other ascendancy. So what you're going to look at there is that, so Agrippa has an angel, has an intelligence, and has a spirit. And if you read in Agrippa, and it was picked up by Barrett in the Celestial Intelligencer, Agrippa says, well, the intelligence is for good and the spirit is for bad. So I think his idea is that, the positive versus the negative aspect of the planet have something to do with conjuring the intelligence versus the spirit. What I find, though, is that while just conjuring up the spirit is probably going to give you something negative, because the spirit is this kind of blind force that's hard to control. And what you're going to find is that the energy is going to just kind of explode all over the place. And so there's a much greater potential, if you do that, for something negative happening. If, though, you call on, as in my planetary rituals are outlined here, you call on the angel to then call in the intelligence, and then on the intelligence to then call in the spirit, you get a clean hierarchy, and you can direct your charge to all three of them, and the spirit winds up being helpful because the spirit helps with practical effects. The intelligence is good for knowledge. The spirit is good for actually moving stuff around. And so calling them that way, so you've got them in a hierarchy with the angel, the intelligence, and the spirit, prevents that blind force thing from becoming a problem and helps your rituals work a lot better. At one point, I had versions of these rituals where, I was just calling on the angel because it seemed like that was working okay. And then I went back and tested, I'll try calling in the intelligence of the spirit, and it just kicked it up again. And I'm like, I've got to put those in. So it's very helpful to call on them. If you are doing a ritual for knowledge about something, you can call on just the angel and the intelligence, just to give you information. So, for example, if you were working on a void moon and, I want to know how to solve this instead of cast to solve it, conjure the angel, conjure the intelligence. Don't worry about conjuring the spirit. And then just, assuming that you have the ability to communicate with the spirits by, going into the spirit vision or scrying or however you do it, communicate with the spirit and get the information, or even charge the spirit to inspire you with the information. That sometimes works too. They sometimes are a little cagey about telling you directly, but then the ritual will be done and you'll just be resting and the idea will just come to you of, that's totally exactly what to do. And I attribute that to the ritual too, because that's another way in which spirits can act. It's you're receiving the psychic information. It just is a little bit of a delay. Maybe it has to kind of permeate through your psyche before you really notice it or something like that. Not sure of the exact mechanism, but it is a thing that, that does happen in magic. And so, if you don't necessarily get a direct communication, do you get some insight later? And that can actually be a successful result. And so, looking at the planets, you have a system where you could do a lot of stuff. It lines up with a lot of different grimoires and so forth. How I work with these is I do use my ritual template. So I will do the operant field, lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, lesser invoking ritual of the hexagram. And then I will use the greater ritual of the hexagram. Remember, lesser is general, greater is specific. The greater ritual of the hexagram for the planet that I'm working with. And then I'm going to use the god name that I used in my greater hexagram as the name to call the angel name to call the intelligence name to call the spirit. And then I deliver the charge to all three of those entities. There was a little bit of a misunderstanding at one point where, you kind of work down and then charge it to the bottom guy on the totem pole. So the guy that's up top, don't get their hands dirty or something. That's not how I do it. Those names span the Kabbalistic worlds. And so what you're doing is you're delivering a charge that is you're delivering a charge to all of them. And so all of them should act on the corresponding levels to get a successful result. And I found that works quite a bit better than just charging, the bottom spirit, the bottom entity on the list, whether it's the spirit or the intelligence, however you're working. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. One other thing I am going to mention, just because it came up online lately, is there's a Golden Dawn method that uses the lesser ritual of the hexagram and attributes the hexagrams to planetary points. I do not use that with Planetary Magic at all. It doesn't even exist in the thelemic system. And I don't really find that it makes a lot of sense, given that certainly the way that I've been taught is you have the lesser rituals are general, the greater rituals are specific. And so as a result, it's like, well, it would be like a lesser ritual, the pentagram for fire or something like that, which you don't do that either. You do the greater ritual, the pentagram for fire. And it's a much simpler, cleaner system. I mean, I could see where somebody could look at it and try to come up with those attributions and think, oh, hey, this is maybe another thing that I could do. But, I also have never really found it particularly useful. And to me, it makes a lot more sense to keep the lesser greater split the way it is. So it's a couple of things to watch with Planetary Magic. So watch the path versus Sephiroth. There is a lot of confusion of that. And if you separate them out, they work better. The paths, actually, they have their own god names. So if you look in Liber 777, there's a separate set of god names in the god names in Asaya that are not the same god names as what you'll find for the Sephiroth, which are, keys 1 through 10. So for example, Jupiter, the god name, the Sephirothic god name is El, and the path god name is Abba, Aleph, Beth, Aleph. Those names are also from Agrippa, and they tend to be mathematical. They tend to go to the gematria of the Sephiroth, but they are related to the path, and they are related to the practical power, not the mystical realization power. Now, these angels are smart enough to usually figure out what you're going for, so you could do a Sephirothic thing for something practical, and they'll still figure it out. It's not like you can't do it, but as with timing, as with everything, the more precise you are, the more effective your operations can be. And that's, really what we're going for as far as, both, illumination, what you want, you want to get, the greatest realization you can from a ritual, just like with a practical operation, you want to get the biggest probability shift in the material world to get what you want. And so otherwise, the general stuff pretty much applies. There's stuff like, don't use this as a substitute for mundane action. Don't do a healing spell and then don't go to the doctor. That's bad. That's like how faith healers get in trouble. All the stuff is complementary. There's nothing you're ever going to be. You're not going to going into the doctor isn't going to negate your spell. They work kind of on different levels of reality, and you should be fine. Similarly, if you're looking at something like getting a job, well, usually you're going to have to do some mundane actions to do that. It's like the lottery. Okay, well, you can cast a lottery spell if you want, but if you don't buy a ticket, your odds of winning are 0. Okay, and magic is not going to make that happen. I did read a story once where somebody didn't buy a ticket. They were in their car in a parking lot. Lottery ticket blew along the parking lot. They picked it up and they turned it in and they won some money. I have heard of that happening once, but it's very, very unlikely. You're not going to do a spell to win the lottery and then just not buy a ticket and have something like that happen. And so with jobs, again, you have to send out resumes. You have to apply for jobs. You have to do that kind of stuff. And in a lot of ways, the practical work with the planets, as with all practical work, is, well, you could do this much of a probability shift with your spell, and then you do enough mundane action to bring the likelihood of success in line with what the spell can do. And then you get the combination of action and luck that, will allow you to do it at a much higher rate than you would see otherwise due to chance, just taking those actions. But at the same time, it gives you an advantage over, somebody maybe who's applying for the same job who isn't using magic. And you should always use magic. Always, always, always. Everything in your life, if you want something, do magic for it. And so I'm a big believer in that as far as practical work. Let me see. You don't need to have knowledge and conversation with the Holy Guardian Angel to do planetary magic, but it helps. You can certainly sit down and start working with it, and it'll be fine. You do the knowledge and conversation, you're going to find that not just your planetary magic, all your magic will get better in terms of the shifts it can produce. So, useful to do the Holy Guardian Angel at the same time, useful to do practical stuff to make your life the way you want it to be, and so that it can facilitate that kind of mystical work, the way you want to go about doing it. Let's see. I think that's all the pointers that I have there additionally on Planetary Magic. So like I say, the next video we're going to be updating is going to be for the Taurus Elixir. We're going to be doing that at the lodge on Tuesday, and I will try to get it recorded this weekend so it'll post Tuesday and all that, since I've been bad about staying on the schedule. Then after that, the next video I'm going to be putting up will be talking about zodiacal magic. So the three complete systems: elements, planets, and signs, which basically represent the full symbol set of Western esoteric magic. So with that, I'm going to sign off here. Have a great rest of the evening, and thank you very much for watching. Love is the law, love endure well.